everyone, welcome to our sewing video today. Today we're going to make fabric baskets. This is the large and it holds quite a bit. I have some yarn in here and I have 4 skeins of yarn in here, so it holds quite a bit. Be great for clothes or towels. This is a little mini. It's not the same pattern that we're using today, but it's similar in that it has outer fabric and then a lining, and then you roll it over as a cuff like we did here. So this pattern is pretty simple, one of the easier baskets to make, I think. And let's look at the different sizes you can do and then the supplies you need. So in your supply list you have a cutting guide that shows 3 different sizes. This is the large, and today I'm going to make the small. There's also a medium that's in between. You need 2 different fabrics, and I have this pretty floral print, these pretty flowers, and then just they call it a grunge, kind of a dirty color of orange and gray, and that's going to be the lining and will end up being the accent cuff on the outside. And then the other thing you need is this Fusible Interfacing. And I purchased the featherweight, and there's different weights. So if you make the bigger basket, you might want to look for a heavyweight. That'll give you a little bit more stability on the sides. But you do need some of that, and that gets ironed to the fabric to give it some body. So let's look at the cutting that we're going to do. Let's see, I'll put it right there so I can reference my dimensions, and I'll move my basket out of the way for now. Okay, so for the small basket we need 2 pieces of each fabric measuring 13 by 13. So I have them still folded with the fabric. So the fabric comes about 42 inches wide, and it's on the bolt folded in half. So if I keep it folded and I cut the 13 inches, that will give me my 2 pieces. You can cut these you can cut these separately. Because I've done the other one before and I'm familiar with what I'm making, I'm going to cut them together. Let's put this one on top so we can see it because it's smaller. And I like to stand up when I cut, so come up here. So I have my large cutting mat. I have my larger ruler, which is 6.5 by 24. I have a smaller ruler, but you can still use the big one to cut out the corners. And I have a rotary cutter. Here's my rotary cutter. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is just lay this out and get everything nice and straight. And I'm going to line it up with a couple lines on the mat. So I have nice straight edges already because I cut the fabric off for my first basket, for my large one. So I already have a nice even straight line. If you don't have a straight line on your fabric, you'll want to trim that. Just trim the very edge of it with the rotary cutter or your scissors, just to make it nice and straight. So I'm lining up the 2 fabrics, and I'm lining it up on one of my mat and my ruler lines, and then the other one the folded side I'm lining up with one of the lines going horizontal. Let's get this out of the way. Okay. So we need 13 by 13. So I'm going to come with my ruler and find where 13 is. So 13 here. So I would need to cut here. And that's on my mat at this point in time. It's on the 11 inch. So just line up my ruler. And so this width right here is 13 inches. And then I'm going to cut all the way across. It's just easier that way. You don't have to. You could cut from the salvage edge. Just come up 13 inches and cut your square out like that. But I find it easier to just go ahead and cut the whole width of fabric. Okay, I'm going to set this aside because that's all the fabric we need. And now I'm just going to trim off the salvage. These are the edges here where you see some printing, some white areas. You don't want to put that into your project. It has a tighter weave, so it doesn't behave the same as the rest of the fabric, so you don't want to have that in your seam or in your project. So again, I'm just going to trim that off, cutting through all 4 layers. I've got 4 layers here all together. 2 of the striped ones because it was folded, 2 of the flowers because it was folded. Okay, and now I'm going to cut my 13-inch square. So just lining it up again, that just helps me get straight lines when I cut. And then going from the top of the ruler, line the 13 up with the edge of my fabric, and that will get me at 10 inches this time. So I'm just using that line at 10 inches as a guide to make sure that I'm cutting it straight and I'm not cutting it at an angle. Okay, all lined up. There, and then this is extra fabric. You might be able to make a mini basket out of that. Okay, the next thing we need to do on our fabric is to cut out the bottom corners. So because I'm using a stripe, I want to make sure I have it going the direction that I want it to go. So on my first basket, I have the stripes going around. So that means this would be the top, this would be the sides. If I want the stripes going up and down, I could cut it this way, make this the top, and the stripes going down the side. I think I'm going to keep it the same as the other one. So that'll be my top. On the floral fabric, it doesn't matter which direction it goes. Nope, wanted to double check. But if you have what we call directional fabric, so if you had some flowers that were going in one direction, you would want to make sure that you put the top up here and you're going to cut out corners on the bottom. So the corners for the small basket are 3 inches. So what I'm going to do with this, using this smaller ruler, is I'm going to line up the 3-inch along the side of the fabric and 3-inch along the bottom. So what is going to happen, I'm going to cut out a 3-inch square. Now I want to be careful not to cut too far beyond the edge of the ruler here. So just go real slow. I come up, just barely come up to that corner and stop. I can always come back and cut some more if that's not enough. And see, it's not quite enough. So the other thing you can do is just take some scissors and carefully snip the rest of that. What you want to avoid is a big cut that's coming into your fabric, because we will be sewing a seam along this cut edge, so we want to make sure that we catch everything into the seam allowance. Alright, and then same thing on this other corner, but I have to turn it in order to use the rotary cutter. So again, 3 inches along the bottom, 3 inches along the side. Just carefully cut. And if you don't have a rotary cutter, just take your pencil and draw a line, and then take your scissors and cut. All right, oh, I think I got that one pretty good. Just a couple threads hung on. Snip those off and I should be good. There we go. So the fabric is all ready to sew, but I'm going to set that aside for a minute because there's one other thing we need to cut. And I like to do this separately because the interfacing is a little bit heavier. I'm just going to tear some of this paper off. Okay, so for this one, again, we need 2 pieces that are 13 inches square. So I just want to make sure that I have 13 inches, and I can use my cutting mat to measure. So I'm looking at from the 10, if I go 13, that would be 23. So that's right about here. So if I fold it right about there, I'll be able to get 2 cuts at 13 inches each. So probably the easiest thing to do is just cut again all the way across. And then we're finished with this. Again, I'm just lining this up so I have it, I'm cutting straight. So I have that on the 22, so 13 inches would be the 9-inch. And what I'm doing now is I'm just trimming this folded edge off. So we will end up with 2 pieces. Okay? And then from this side, I'm going to measure 13 inches. And I'm left-handed, so it might look backwards to you guys. So let me put it on the 23. That makes the math easy. So line this up on the 23-inch. But however you need to measure it, you could just use a big ruler, measure 13 inches and mark it with a pen or a pencil, and then come in with scissors and cut on that line. So 13 inches, 23 minus 13 is 10, so I'm going to line up my ruler on the 10-inch. And because it's a square, it doesn't matter which way we assign which side we assign the bottom. There is a little bit of a stretch, so I would do the stretchiness probably side to side. Probably doesn't matter because once it's fused on, it's not going to stretch. All right, so I have those layered together nice and even, and taking my smaller ruler just because it works easier. You can still use this ruler and just line up 3-inch and 3-inch. Now in this, because it's getting ironed on, don't worry about cutting over the edge just a little bit. So there's my 2 pieces. And we'll cut out the corners on the other side. And there we go. All right, the next step is to fuse the interfacing to the outside fabrics. This is my lining. That's the part that's going to curve down and at the top and make the cuff. This is the main part of the outside. So this interfacing has to be fused down. There's glue on one side. You can feel it, it's rough and bumpy. And this side feels kind of like felt. So put it down that way. Put the glue side against the wrong side of the fabric. And I just have a little pressing mat here today, but I think it'll work. So I'll just have to move it around. I also like to press it from the fabric side because this is, it's just a fiber, and if your iron is too hot, it'll kind of melt it, make it all like bubbly. So I'd like to press it from the fabric side. So you just want to get heat on there for a while to melt that glue. So you don't really have to press hard, you just have to leave the heat on there long enough for the heat to melt the glue. And then I can check it. I didn't press right here, so I can check it. Yeah, that feels like it's sticking pretty good. Try not to overheat it, because then you, like I said, you start to get the bubbles. And be careful, like I've got a little bit peeking out here. I could get glue on my iron if I get too close. So I'm gonna just go up to the edge, and then we need to do this part. And this little section right here. I think that's everything. All right, so I've got my one piece ready. So I'm going to put glue side up and then the wrong side against the interfacing. So we're just fusing that onto the back of the fabric just to make it stiffer. That gives you the body to your basket. If it was just fabric on the larger baskets, it would be too flimsy and your basket wouldn't probably wouldn't stand up very well unless you put, you know, something in it like yarn, or if you're storing yarn in it, that might be okay, or more fabric or clothes. Once you put stuff in it, it would be sturdier. Again, just a little bit of heat. Don't overheat it either. This iron is really hot, so if your iron is not super hot, you might have to take a little bit longer. Mine doesn't take long because my iron is really hot. It's an older iron, but I don't want to get rid of it because it gets super hot. Some of the newer ones just aren't quite as hot, I don't think. Okay, and be careful when you touch the fabric, especially my iron. It's really hot. Okay, so I'm going to put these two together like this. Right sides together is what we call it. And we're ready to start sewing. So I'm going to sew down this side, across the bottom, and then up this side here. Okay, so, and you can decide how big your seam is. On the basket, on quilting, I like to use a 1/4 inch. We always use a 1/4 inch seam. But for the baskets, I like to use about 3/8 of an inch for my seam. Just gives it a little bit more in the seam allowance and makes it a little bit sturdier. So just line these two up. If you want to put a couple pins in here, you can, just so those fabrics don't shift, because the main thing is you want to have those edges even when you sew all the way down. Now, if you're a beginner sewer and you have trouble with your seam allowance or sewing straight, you know, it's hard to guide the fabric straight through and get a stitch line that goes really straight. So what you could do is take your ruler, and I'm going to mark at 3/8 of an inch. So it's just a little bit over, it's between a 1/4 inch and a 1/2 inch. But the markings are on my ruler, so it's pretty simple. And you just draw a line with a pencil or a pen. Just be careful, don't, some of the markers will bleed through, so I usually use a pencil. And I am going to do a back stitch at the beginning and at the end, just because we're not enclosing these seams until later, and I don't want the seams to start to come, the stitching to start coming apart. So I start about a 1/2 inch in from the fabric, from the edge, and then I back stitch, and then I come forward. So I'm going to back stitch first and then move forward. because I drew that line there, I'm just using it as a guide to where the needle goes in. So you've got your line in front of you, just aim it straight for the center of your presser foot towards your needle. Don't look at your needle, look at where the fabric is coming into the area where the presser foot is. So I'm aiming right for the middle of the presser foot. So if that drawn line goes in between my presser foot, I know the needle's going to hit in the right spot. Okay, back stitch a few here. Needle up. And then just trim your threads off. I'm going to do the same thing for the bottom. Just line up those fabrics, line up the edges. I like to pin, but on shorter edges like this one, you don't have to. Once you get the needle, once you start sewing at the top here, just stop, line everything up, hold it with your fingers, and then you can let it go through. Now this time I didn't draw, so now I need to look at my guide on my face plate and see where 3/8 of an inch is. So I get 3/8 of an inch seam. Needle down, back stitch first, and then go forward. So now I'm using the edge of my presser foot as my guide of where the fabric needs to be. And that way I know it's 3/8 of an inch, because I didn't draw the stitch line on this one. But for some of the other classes I've taught it in person, you know, I see students do a lot better, especially beginners, you know, if they have that line drawn. Because if you look, you know, my stitch is really straight. It doesn't come in and then wave that way and this way. It's very straight. And that's important to get your projects to lay flat and to cooperate and fold the way you want them to. So whether you're sewing garments or pillowcases or fabric baskets or making quilts, you want that straight seam line. Unless you're sewing curves, then you have to follow the edge of the curve. But we're sewing straight lines today, so you want your seam to be, your sewing line to be straight also. Okay, we're going to back stitch first, and then come forward. And my thread just broke. All right, needle up. Something got jammed up in there, so I'm gonna have to rethread. So I'm just gonna clip these threads that broke off. I got a few stitches in there that will still be okay. So I could take a seam ripper and take those out, but I think they'll be okay. Just my top thread just broke. So whenever that happens, I like to come up to the top and just rethread the whole thing. I don't try to catch it down here and rethread it through the needle. I just rethread my whole machine, because it may have been something up here in the tension area that caused it to break, and by rethreading the whole machine, I know that I have everything back to normal. I have a needle threader on my machine, which is great, but on this machine, I should say. I have an older Singer machine and it doesn't have a needle threader, so I have to poke it through with my fingers, and sometimes it's hard to get it through. Okay, so what I want to make sure is that I start back far enough, and I might do just a couple back stitches just to make sure I lock in that thread as I start to sew again. So a couple back stitches and then I'll go forward. So just be patient with your machine. There'll be times when the thread breaks, the needle breaks, or you might be sewing a big long seam and you get to the end and you realize, oh, you ran out of bobbin thread back here. So just take your time, fix your machine, and sew over again. All right, I'm coming to the edge. I'm going to backstitch. And there we are. So there's our basket, the outer basket. Now the next phase, I have to trim these since I had to start over. Let's see, trim these. I like to trim my threads as I go so they don't get in my way when I'm sewing other seams. Okay, the next step on the outer fabric is to make our corners. So we're just going to open up where this hole is from where you cut out the corners. Grab these two V's and then push these fabrics together. And for the seams here, you can either press them open, or you can press one to one side and one to the other side. And maybe I'll press those first. I like to press mine open. It's hard to get to though on this little basket. Let me see if I can get this down here. So I'm going to finger press it open with my fingernail, and then I'm just going to use the tip of my machine because I don't want to put a crease here where I've folded it. So I'm just going to use the tip of my iron to get in there and press that seam. And that'll just help us with the seams, won't be so bulky, they'll lay nice and flat. Because they're thick now because of that interfacing. So just get the tip of your iron in there and press that seam down. And you want to make sure that it's folded, it's pressed open, meaning on the inside here, it's pressed all the way to the opening. You don't have a little pinch there or a little pleat on your seam. So that's why the finger pressing helps get that seam open on the inside and the outside. Okay, again, just with the tip of my iron. There, that'll help. Okay, so let's go back to the machine. So I'm going to grab at the V here, and I'm just going to pinch these fabrics together, and I'm going to line up those two seams, and then Oh, let me grab some clips. I like using clips when you have all this interfacing. The clips work better. Ow. Sorry. My chair won't move. There we go. The pins will go through it. It's just thicker. So these little clips, if you've seen my previous videos, I've used them before. They're called Wonder Clips. And again, I'm going to sew about 3/8 of an inch across here. And if you need to measure that and draw it out, feel free to do that. 3/8 of an inch is going to be right about there. It's hard to do now that I have the clips in there. But I could just mark some guidelines, some points that I could aim for. I don't know if you can see the pencil marks, but I just made a couple marks that'll help me. That'll guide me as I'm sewing to make sure I'm staying 3/8 of an inch. Okay, so I'm coming about a 1/2 inch in from this edge. Now the edge is on an angle, so you want to make sure you start in about 1/2 inch, back stitch all the way to the folds, and then come forward. Back stitch, and then come forward. Okay, as I get close to the pins, or the clips, I just take them off. When I get to the next edge, I just do a couple back stitches, and that's it. That's it for that side. Now we have one more side to do. But this one will be easy because you've already done one. So same thing, put your fingers in on the V and pull your fabric and push it together so those two seams come together. I'm going to line those up. And let's see if we can do the ruler. See if we can do our line first. So there's my 3/8. You can just put a dotted line there or a solid line, doesn't matter. And now I have my sew line, my guide for where I'm going to sew. All right, so I'm going to make sure those are matching. Put the clip in, and I can probably do this seam with just the one clip. My thread's out of the way. Again, back stitch to the edge and then go forward. Remove the clip, and I'm going to hold the seam down. Hold those fabric edges down so they don't get messed up. Hopefully the ones underneath didn't shift. When I get to the edge, I'm going to backstitch. And our seam allowance on the bottom didn't flip, so it helps to put the clip in there right on that seam, and that holds the seam open. Otherwise, when you come up on your presser foot and your feed dog, sometimes it wants to flip it over. So just be aware of that and watch it as you're sewing, that you don't end up with your seams flip. If they do flip, you know, just take your seam ripper and rip out a little bit of the seam there. Come back in and just sew, re-sew that section again. If it's not too bad, if it's just a little flip, just leave it. It's on the inside of your project, so really wouldn't bother me if it was there. Okay, so that's the outside of our bag. I'm going to turn it right side out and push out these corners. Oh, that's nice. That's going to be a pretty basket. I think that large one was nice for my yarn, but I think this is going to be great for my sewing table. Put some of my supplies in it. Okay, the next step is to work on our lining. So again, we have the same size pieces, and we're going to put, again, right sides together. But this time, we need to leave an opening in order to turn our project right side out when we're finished. So one way to do that, and it doesn't matter which side you do it on, so I'll just mark this one. So one way to do it is just with a pen or a pencil. And I'm going to put it down more towards the bottom. But what I like to do is just put two pins right next to each other. If you put just one pin, you forget that it was marking your opening. But if you put two, it's like, oh yeah, I was going to stop there or start there. So you have two sections, 2 points. Where are you going to start sewing and where are you going to stop sewing? So we're going to sew this the same. We're going to come all the way down this side, across the bottom, but then on this side, I'm going to start here and stop here. And then I'm going to start here and stop at the top. And we're going to leave this section right here open so that we can turn our project right side out at the end. So line up your edges. Since you cut these together, they should match up pretty well. I like to pin, but if you don't feel like pinning, that's okay too. So I'm going to go ahead and pin all my sides, so I'm just ready to start sewing them all. It's basically the same as the outside fabric, so nothing new there except where we're starting and stopping and leaving an opening. Again, come in here and draw your lines if that helps. Couple back stitches and then go forward. I'm just trying to grab my threads so they don't get tangled up on the back. Go all the way to the edge and back stitch. Okay, now I'm going to sew the bottom. Again, back stitch first. Go forward. Oops. Runaway pin. And just take your time. You don't have to sew as fast as I do. Okay, needle up. I did a couple back stitches there. And then I'm going to start with a few back stitches, go forward. So I'm just going to kind of visualize where the stop is. So it's going to be like right about here where the pins were. So I'm going to sew up to where the pins were, approximately. Doesn't have to be exact. It's just, you just want a big enough opening, probably about 4 inches. If you have small hands, you can probably do 3 inches, but my hands are pretty big, so I usually do 4 inches. And I backstitch there to lock that in, so when we're turning everything right side out, the stitches won't start to come out. Now what's nice about this striped fabric is it leaves lines, so where the pins were, it's that dark orange line, so I know that's exactly where I need to start. So I'm going to start a little bit in front of that and backstitch to that orange line, and then I'm going to go forward. Backstitch at the end. Now the reason we backstitch is because a lot of times these seams don't get locked into another seam, so I call them final seams. So if that's your final seam, you want to do a backstitch so it doesn't come unraveled. Okay, and then we just need to do the corners the same as the outside fabric. Grab that V section and oh yeah, let's press too. That'll help if we press these open. Now this is the side that has the opening, so I'm just going to pretend like there's a seam there, and I'll start at the top here and press that open, and then down here at the bottom I'll press that open. Then if you kind of just pull on this, it'll just automatically fold. So if you press those now, it won't hurt anything. That'll just help you when you go to close it at the end to know where to fold the fabric under. So I'm just going to get in here with my fingernails, making sure that the fabric is opened up on that seam, front and back, and then just using the tip of my iron, press on that seam. And my iron shut off. There we go. All right, this one. Now to help open up the front, you can also just press to one side first. I'm just kind of pulling to make sure that that fabric is opened up. So I press to one side first to get the front open, and then open the back. But this is just the way I like to do it. You could also just press the seam to the side. This type of project, it really doesn't matter. All right, so we're ready to do our corners. So I like to put the bottom on the bottom. Grab my V's and put my fabrics, bring my fabrics together. Line up the seams there, And you can either use a pin or a clip, because this is just fabric, there's no interfacing. I'm going to be sewing this way, so I like to put the pin on the top part of the seam, and that'll hold that seam allowance from flipping up when I sew. So that's nice and flat there. Again, if you want to mark your 3/8 of an inch, just put your little ruler here and do a solid line or a dotted line, just a few marks so you have a guideline. Okay, and I'm going to do a back stitch to the edge and then come forward. Make sure you take your pin out. Try not to sew over your pins, it's not good for your machine. There we go. Back stitch at the other end. Clip my threads. So this little basket's supposed to be a little trash bag for my threads, but I have a big trash can on the floor here, so I usually use that. All right, let's go to the other side. Again, I like to put the bottom on the bottom. It just seems to fold down better. Oh, there's some seams we didn't clip, or I'm sorry, threads we didn't clip. Pull on the pull on the V and line up those fabrics. I'm lining up the seams, and I'm lining up the edge of the fabric. And on this small basket, because the corners are smaller, you probably don't need to have as many pins. Again, you could mark your 3/4 inch. The nice thing about using striped fabric is I have some lines there already, so if I know which one I'm following, I just follow that line. Okay, back stitch to the edge and then come forward. Take my pin out. And back stitch at the end. So on these corners, the back stitching is more important than on the sides, you know, the other seams that we've done. Because eventually we will be sewing across these seams, but I like to back stitch just to keep everything in place. Because it's a small project and we're turning it a lot, if I didn't back stitch, this seam would start to come apart. So on bags and baskets, I like to do a lot of back stitching on my seams. But it's real important on the corners here, because that's the final seam and there won't be anything else going over top of this seam. So you want to make sure you back stitch on those. Clip my threads. Oh, I see my doggies outside playing. All right, now comes the next step. Is kind of fun. We're going to leave the lining inside out, and then we're going to take the outside fabric and have it with the right side out. Kind of bunch it up here. We're going to stick it inside the lining. And then we're going to match up these side seams. And I'm going to use a pin, just because the clips are nice, but sometimes they do come off if you pull. They get pulled on. And then come across on the other side and match up that seam. So matching the lining with the outer fabric. So I'm matching up the seams, and I'm lining up the edge of the fabric at the top. And so don't worry about what's inside. All you're going to worry about is the top edge of these two fabrics. And what you want to do is just line them up and smooth them out. Now, it might end up that one piece is a little bit bigger than the other. So if you have to put a little pleat in there, don't worry about it. I think that happened on my big one. The outside was a little bit bigger than my lining. And that just happens sometimes because of your seam allowance, if you don't always do a consistent seam allowance. So if you know, one of these seam allowances was a little bit smaller, then it's going to make your project bigger. Or if the seam allowance was bigger, then it's going to shrink up your project, make it smaller. So we're just lining these up as best we can. The lining, because there's no interfacing on it, the lining might have a little bit of a stretch. Mine doesn't, because I cut it that way. On your fabric, one direction there's no stretch, the other direction, so I've got a little more stretch this way. So if I had put my stripes going up and down, I would have a little more stretch this way in case my outer fabric was a little bit bigger. But I think this is coming out pretty good. Okay. Now, there's two options for sewing this lining together. Even though we put the pins on the outside, what I like to do is put it under the presser foot and sew on the inside. So this part of the project is out of your way. If you try to push this out of the way and sew on this side, when you turn it and such, the other side wants to get in the way. The other option, if your machine has it, my extension table comes off and I have just a small arm here now. And I can put the basket around that arm. So if you have that as an option, you could sew it that way. I think I'm going to do it. Ouch. Those pins are sharp. Let me show you how to do it this way, because a lot of you might not have this option to use. It's usually like I think they call it a cuff for like making shirt cuffs or pant legs. But the other thing too is, if you have this interfacing facing up, it'll be easier to sew on. If it's facing down, it might not slide as well underneath your presser foot. So I like to sew with the interfacing up. So let's do it that way. And you just want to scoop this, and I usually start where one of the side seams are. And again, we're going to do about 3/4 of an inch. And this one you don't have to back stitch, because we're going to come all the way around and we'll do a back stitch at the end. So I'm just going to take my time, adjust my project, bring it around so I've got some fabric in front of my presser foot, in front of my needle. I'll sew a few inches. Like I'll go to the next pin, take that out, and now I'll readjust my fabric, just carefully moving things around, trying to make everything on the bottom nice and flat. There, at the next pin, take that out. Pull things around to the front. And this works pretty good on the small, medium, and large baskets, but if you made really tiny baskets, then it's not as easy. Then it's easier to use the cuff. All right, turn this around. You just want to work your fabric nice so it's nice and flat where you're going to be sewing. So the next section that you're going to sew, it's nice and flat against the table. All right, almost to the other side. That was the last pin, so we're coming up we're coming up on the start. So I'm just going to aim for my stitching. If I've been good at judging 3/4 of an inch, I should be okay. But as you get closer to your starting seam, just look and see where you are now and aim for that starting seam so that everything lines up. So if you veered off a little bit, you're just going to get back on track when you get to the end. And back stitch a little bit here, and then cut your threads off. All right, awesome. Hope everything's coming out on your projects. Okay, so here's my opening, and this is where I'm going to turn it inside out. So I'm just going to crunch up, smush up the outside part, and I'm going to pull it through this opening. And just be careful. So this is why we backstitch here, because when we're pulling this through, these seams are being stressed, and if I didn't backstitch, they'd start to come apart. So I'm just going to gently pull this all out. And now I'm going to pull the lining, turn the lining right side out too. So first off, I like to come in and just with my finger push the corners out. I'm going to do that on the lining, and then this is where you need to be able to put your hand all the way in to the bag, and I push those corners out. We did that before, so they should just pop right back out, but just in case, you could also can't get my hand out. You can also kind of finger press our corner seams open. We never pressed those after we sewed them, which you don't have to, but if they're not laying flat, you might need to press them open now, or just from the outside. Just kind of want to make sure that they're open. Okay, so now we're going to take our lining here, and if you would like to hand stitch this closed with a needle and thread, you could just sew an invisible seam to close that up. But because it's going to be inside the basket and nobody's really going to see it, I like to just pinch these together, line them up where we folded them. We pressed them before, so they should be ready to sew. They should be folded already. So you just have to line them up and then just figure out where does it start. So mine starts at that line, and where does it end? And then mine ends over here. So I'm going to put a pin at the end so I know where the end is. And we're just going to sew a little teeny tiny top stitch. So about 1/8 of an inch in, we're going to top stitch along there, and that will close up that opening. Find where to start. Okay, so I'm going to start about 1/2 inch below my opening, really close to the edge, back stitch a little bit, and then come forward, and we want to do about 1/8 of an inch, smaller if you can. But when you're doing a small top stitch like that, the feed dogs are only catching fabric on one side. There's 2 feed dogs, and so if only one side is catching fabric, your fabric sometimes shifts. So just be careful, just go slow. Most machines do okay, but you just have to check yours and watch it, see what it does. As long as one of the feed dogs is catching that fabric, you should be okay. And then at the end, I kind of angle off to the edge, sew right to the edge, and then back stitch. So I just did a little angle right to the very edge of that fold, and trim my threads. Okay, so our lining is all finished now, and see, you can barely see that. You know, it just looks like you meant to do that. All right, so the next step is to push the lining down into the basket. And mine doesn't want to open up. There we go. So you just want your bottom to go down, and because we lined up these seams, everything, even though our basket is square, it would be okay if you didn't line up your seams. But if you do a basket that is not square, you want to make sure that you have your lining in there correctly so that it goes the same way as your outer piece. So the next step is a top stitch, and that's just to hold down the edge of our lining. So we're going to fold, and I'm going to iron this. I'm just finger pressing right now to get that lining to make sure it's opened up all the way away from the front fabric, and my seam allowance is still facing up, but we're going to roll that down, so we're going to fold in right on that seam, and it's a little stubborn sometimes. So if you work it so from the inside here, just going to fold it over and press it, and then it'll be easier to work with when we go to sew it. So I'm a big fan of pressing and pinning. Some people don't, but I find that my projects come out a little more accurate, more polished, they're neater. If I take the time to pin, I take the time to press. But certainly a lot of people don't, and their stuff just looks great too. So whatever works for you. There, I think I went all the way around. So here's another example of where I could come in and I could pin this. I could put some pins in here to make sure that it stayed folded down. But I really don't have to. I've pressed it so I can adjust it and make sure it's laying flat as I go. So in this case, this is an example of how you would do sewing without pinning. But what that means is every so often you have to stop and make sure that everything is lining up or everything's folding over as you want it. And that's the part where when I'm sewing fabric together, like when we did the side seams, I don't like to stop and realign things. I like to pin it and then I could just go. But for this part, because it's a top stitching, I don't feel like I need to pin it. So I'm going to get my threads out. So I'm going to come in, on this time I'm going to do about 1/4 inch. Anywhere from 1/4 inch to 1/8 of an inch from the edge on the top stitch. And that just helps the top of your basket stay flat, stay folded. And if you use contrasting thread, so say I used a really bright yellow, it would show up. But we're going to fold this top down, so we're going to see the lining. So my lining is orange and blue and gray. So if I used, I'm just using a light blue thread right now. So most of my top stitching is going through an orange stripe. So you will be able to see that blue thread. And a lot of times when you're top stitching, that's when you want contrasting thread sometimes, so you can see it better. So just like on blue jeans, you'll have that gold thread as a top stitch, and you can see it. It's a pretty contrast with the blue. But now I'm sewing more on one of the bluish gray lines, so I won't see that thread as much because it's going to blend in more. So I'm just shifting and turning, making sure that the fold is right on the seam. All right, I'm coming up to the end. So again, here, I'm gonna trim these threads just so they don't get caught in my seam. So I'm coming up on the starting seam and I'm gonna aim for it. So that way, if your top stitching wasn't exactly the same from when you started, you'll at least finish the same. So you're going to come and you're going to stitch over top of your starting seam just a little bit, and then back stitch a few. And that just locks the thread down so it doesn't come out. Now this trimming I'm going to cut right up to the fabric so I don't have any little threads hanging down. Okay, that's all the sewing. I'm just going to make sure I've got a nice basket here, and then you fold the edge over. And on the small one, you know, maybe about, what is that? Maybe, what is that? About 2 inches, maybe 1.5 inches. But you can decide how much you want to fold it over. You just kind of want to make sure that the lining is laying flat down in there. And then if you want to, just to kind of give it some extra help, once you have it all folded, is to just press it a little bit. That just gives it a little bit extra memory to the fold. Makes the fold is a little bit flatter. But make sure the lining's all the way down in there. It wants to come up on mine. Just trying to get out. There we go. So there's our fabric basket. There's the lining. Get that all nice and flat inside. There we go. So it matches my large basket. And I don't think I have enough fabric to make the medium, but it sure would have been cute if I had enough fabric. But those are so cute. Even though this is a small basket, I like that size. I think that would be a nice handy size. And the big one is just perfect for my yarn, so I like that one too. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to teaching you some more sewing projects in the future. Thank you.